When Emily Caldwell pulled a rusted engine from the bottom of the Atlantic, she thought she was just restoring a forgotten piece of metal. But what she uncovered wasn't just machinery. It was a buried invention, a prototype that could have changed the course of history, hidden deep within a sunken ship no one had touched for nearly a century. This isn't just a story about a restored engine, it's about an incredible discovery, a hidden history the world tried to forget, and a quiet woman who refused to let it stay buried. So stay with us, because what happens next will leave you in awe. Let's get started. It all began on the foggy shores of Port Haven, a quiet coastal town where time seemed to drift as slowly as the tides. Emily Caldwell wasn't your average marine salvager. With wild auburn curls tucked beneath her diving hood and a heart tethered to the past, she had spent decades uncovering stories the ocean tried to bury. One morning, just as the sun pierced the mist over the Atlantic, Emily dove into the deep with her loyal retriever, Max, waiting anxiously on the boat above. What she sought wasn't treasure, it was truth. Her gut had been pulling her toward this one forgotten corner of the seabed for months. Locals whispered of an old cargo steamer that sank during a storm in the 1930s, but no one had ever found proof. Until now. As her flashlight cut through the murky water, a dark, hulking silhouette emerged. Not the ship, not yet, but something stranger. Half buried in the silt lay a massive, corroded engine. It was monstrous in size, alien in design, and completely out of place. She hovered silently in awe, the weight of history pressing against her chest like the ocean itself. Something told her this was only the beginning. Emily couldn't sleep that night, even as the waves lapped gently against the docked boat and the town of Port Haven fell into its usual hush. Her mind raced with images of that rust-covered giant she'd seen. The engine was unlike anything she had ever encountered, and she'd spent nearly 20 years diving wrecks along the eastern seaboard. It didn't match any model she knew. Something about its build, its sheer complexity, had haunted her. By morning, she'd made up her mind. With the help of her old friend and metalworking expert, Henry Lawson, a man who could fix just about anything with his bare hands and a blowtorch, they mounted a full-scale retrieval mission. It took 3 dives, 2 oxygen tanks, and a near storm to finally bring the engine up from the sea's grip. When it broke the surface, barnacles clinging and water streaming from its gears, Emily felt like she was witnessing a resurrection. The moment it hit the deck, everyone went quiet. It wasn't just big, it was elegant, in its own brutal, forgotten way. Henry ran his gloved hand along the oxidized casing. "This isn't commercial," he muttered. This is one of a kind." That was all Emily needed to hear. The next few weeks became a blur of sparks, sweat, and salt air. Emily turned her father's old boat shed into a makeshift restoration workshop. Inside, under a flickering fluorescent bulb and surrounded by scattered blueprints, she began the impossible. Every bolt she unscrewed whispered a story. Some nights, Max would curl up beside her, his fur covered in rust flakes from nuzzling too close. Henry came by after work most days, shaking his head at the madness but always returning with new parts, tools, or just coffee. Emily documented everything, every gear removed, every layer of corrosion peeled back like dead skin revealing veins of steel beneath. It wasn't just about fixing a machine. It was about understanding it. But the deeper she went, the more confusing it became. She found a brass plate hidden beneath layers of grime, etched with initials and a date H. Merryweather, 1932. Prototype 3. Prototype. Emily's hands trembled as she read it aloud. Henry's brow furrowed. "Harrison Merryweather," he repeated. "That name rings a bell. He was some kind of naval engineer. Genius, vanished mysteriously mid-century. There were rumors he was working on revolutionary engine designs, quiet, more powerful, more efficient. A chill rippled down Emily's spine. This wasn't just an engine. It was the engine. Something lost to time, buried before it could ever be recognized. Suddenly, this wasn't just a restoration. It was a resurrection of a forgotten legacy. The turning point came late one evening. Emily had been polishing the central crankshaft when she noticed something strange, a hairline seam near the base that shouldn't have been there. She called Henry over, together. They pried it open and gasped. Inside was a compartment, dry, sealed, protected even after all these decades. Wrapped in oilskin cloth was a bundle of papers, brittle but intact. They laid them out on the workbench. Diagrams, notes, letters, and then a final page. A letter addressed to my son, dated just a week before the ship's recorded sinking. Emily read it aloud, her voice cracking. "If you find this, I pray the world is finally ready. This engine can power ships without smoke or flame. It runs on saltwater conversion, clean, quiet, endless. But they called me a fool, said I was mad. They tried to bury it, and me. But the sea, my boy, the sea keeps secrets until someone cares enough to listen." She looked up at Henry. Neither spoke. Neither had to. From that night on, the workshop felt different. Every tool that touched the machine, every spark that flew, felt sacred. Emily and Henry worked into the coldest nights of November, their breath fogging the air, driven not by fame or fortune, but by duty to finish what Harrison Merryweather had started. Restoring the mechanical parts was grueling. They had to custom fabricate several components using the old notes. But piece by piece, gear by gear, the engine began to take shape again. And with it, something within Emily began to shift, too. She no longer saw herself as just a diver or restorer. She was now a steward of something far greater, a story the world had forgotten, a piece of history that demanded to be heard. Finally, after months of labor, the day arrived. The engine stood proudly in the center of the shed, polished, complete, majestic. The brass plate gleamed like a badge of honor. Henry double-checked the fuel lines re-engineered to simulate the saltwater conversion described in the notes, and Emily held her breath as she reached for the ignition. For a moment, silence. Then a low hum, a sputter, and then roar. The engine came to life with a growl that shook the windows. Max barked wildly. Emily gasped. Henry whooped, arms in the air. But then something even more incredible happened. The engine didn't just run. It pulsed with a rhythm, smooth and almost musical. There was no smoke, no vibration, just pure, elegant motion. A miracle in metal. Tears welled up in Emily's eyes. Not because the machine worked, but because she had brought a ghost back to life. The celebration didn't last long. Just 3 days after the engine roared to life, Emily noticed something was off. She had returned to the workshop early that morning with Max trotting by her side, a steaming cup of coffee in hand, ready to run more diagnostics. But as she stepped inside, her smile vanished. The door was slightly ajar. Inside, the workshop was a mess. Drawers pulled out, tools scattered across the floor, and the protective tarp half ripped from the engine. Max let out a low growl. Ears perked. Emily's heart pounded as she stepped closer. It wasn't vandalism. No graffiti, no broken windows, just someone had been there, and they were looking for something. Her eyes darted to the workbench. The papers, the letters, the schematics, gone. She called Henry immediately. He was stunned, but not surprised. "This engine's not just a historical curiosity anymore," he said, his voice heavy. "It's proof, a prototype of a clean energy system lost to time, and now someone else knows about it. Emily's mind raced. She had only shared the discovery with Henry and posted a single vague photo online in a forum for antique machinery restorers. A photo of the brass plate, captioned, "Restoring a beauty, any guesses what it is?" She hadn't even included a location. But someone must have recognized it. That same evening, as the last golden light slipped over the water, a car pulled up to her dock. It was a sleek black sedan, windows tinted. A man stepped out tall, mid-40s, expensive coat, briefcase in hand. He didn't smile. "Ms. Caldwell?" he asked. "I am," Emily said, standing straighter. He introduced himself as Marcus Rourke, a representative for a private maritime archive foundation. He spoke in smooth, measured tones, but every word felt rehearsed. "We've been tracking historic naval prototypes lost during the interwar years. Some, like Merryweather's, are of significant value not only historically, but commercially." He paused. "We're prepared to offer a substantial sum for the engine. No questions asked. You'll receive full credit for its discovery." Emily felt a cold knot in her chest. She asked how he knew what she had found. He smiled, not answering. "I suggest you consider the offer. The longer you wait, the more complicated things become." And just like that, he left handing her a card with no company name, just a number. That night, Emily couldn't sleep again. Not from excitement this time, but fear. She locked the shed, moved the engine's core components into her father's old storm shelter beneath the dock. She called Henry and told him everything. "This isn't just about history anymore," she whispered. "It's about control, about keeping something this powerful out of the wrong hands." Henry agreed to install a camera system and rig a basic alarm. But even as they worked, Emily felt the air had shifted. She was no longer just reviving the past. She was protecting it. 2 days later, the first letter arrived. No return address. Just an envelope slipped under her door in the early morning fog. Inside a photocopy of Merryweather's blueprint, with a large red X over it, and the words, "Some things are meant to stay buried." Emily's hands shook as she held it. The meaning was clear. This was a warning. But what struck her most wasn't the threat. It was the realization that someone else, somewhere, already knew what Merryweather had built. And they didn't want the world to know. Despite the growing pressure, Emily refused to back down. If anything, the threat only deepened her resolve. She and Henry began digitizing everything: the notes, the schematics, the videos of the restoration. They backed it all up to multiple drives, encrypted, with trusted friends across the country. She reached out to a historian in Boston, Dr. Zoe Whitaker, who specialized in lost naval technologies. At first skeptical, Zoe grew intrigued after seeing the engine footage. "This could change everything," she said over the phone. "If it's what you say it is. This is the missing link in maritime propulsion history." Emily invited her to Port Haven. Dr. Whitaker arrived just as a storm rolled in, casting the town in shades of steel and gray. She spent hours studying the engine, the remaining notes, the compartment where the letter had been hidden. She confirmed it. It's a saltwater-to-energy conversion engine. Merryweather was decades ahead of his time. This wasn't just for ships. He was envisioning applications on land, in cities, everywhere. That's why they silenced him. Emily felt the weight of it all settle on her chest. "So, what now?" Zoe looked her straight in the eye. "You either sell this and it vanishes again for another 100 years, or you risk everything to share it with the world." The next night, the workshop was broken into again. But this time, they weren't just searching. They tried to take it. If not for Max barking loud enough to wake the harbor and Henry arriving minutes later with his shotgun, they might have succeeded. The would-be thieves disappeared into the night, leaving tire tracks in the mud. It was clear now. This was no longer a mystery story. It was a battle. Emily made her decision the next morning. With Dr. Whitaker's help, she contacted a maritime museum in Washington, D.C., not just any museum, but one known for preserving untold stories and pioneering inventions. She asked for protection, exhibition, and a public reveal that couldn't be erased. They agreed. A week later, under tight security, the engine was transported not as a relic, but as a revolution reborn. Emily watched it disappear down the road, Max by her side, heart pounding not with fear anymore, but hope. She had held history in her hands, and now the world would finally hear its voice. Emily had always believed in honoring the past, but she never imagined it would mean defending it. In the days following the engine's departure to Washington, D.C., her workshop felt hollow. The silence was deafening. The scattered tools, grease-stained cloths, and pieces of metal once gave the place a heartbeat. Now it was a museum of memories. She stood in the center of the space one rainy afternoon. Max curled beside her, the scent of oil still hanging in the air. And for the first time, she allowed herself to feel the weight of everything that had happened. She hadn't just restored a machine. She had resurrected a man's dream. And in doing so, she had put herself and everything she loved in the crosshairs of a world far bigger and far darker than she'd ever realized. But something had shifted within her. Before this, Emily lived quietly. She kept to herself, restored small artifacts for local museums, and never sought attention. She loved the solitude of the sea, the certainty of routine, the humbleness of her craft. But now the world knew her name. Emails began pouring in from journalists, engineers, environmentalists. Her phone rang constantly. Some calls were kind, others pushy. There were offers from corporations interested in innovation, requests for interviews from major networks, and even subtle threats disguised as legal warnings. She declined most of them. She didn't care for the spotlight. But deep down, she knew she had a responsibility now. Merryweather's voice, quieted for almost a century, was finally echoing again, and she was the one holding the megaphone. Dr. Whitaker had arranged for the engine's first public showcase to be part of a special exhibit titled Lost Inventions That Could Have Changed Everything. Emily was invited as a guest speaker. She didn't want to go. At first she hated crowds, and public speaking terrified her more than diving to the bottom of the Atlantic. But Henry, with his usual straight-faced wisdom, said, "You didn't come this far to whisper. You found the truth. Now say it out loud." So she went. The auditorium was packed. Families, students, journalists, scientists all gathered beneath a massive banner bearing Merryweather's name. On stage, the engine sat behind glass like a sleeping giant. It had been polished, lit dramatically, and surrounded by panels that explained its mechanics, history, and mystery. But the moment everyone waited for was hers. As Emily stepped onto the stage, hands trembling, she glanced at the crowd, and for a split second, she wanted to run. But then her eyes found Max, sitting calmly beside Henry in the front row. A few faces beyond them, she saw Dr. Whitaker giving her a small nod of encouragement. So she took a breath and spoke. "I'm not a scientist," she began, her voice a bit shaky. "I'm not a historian or an engineer. I'm just someone who listens to what others throw away. I've spent most of my life looking where no one else bothers to look, under rust, beneath waves, in forgotten places." She paused, then continued, her voice steadier. What I found wasn't just a machine. It was a man's legacy. It was hope. Harrison Merryweather wasn't trying to make money. He wasn't building something flashy. He wanted to create a future no one else could imagine at the time. And because of that, his work was buried. But the ocean, she said, her voice softening, doesn't forget. It just waits for someone to care enough. There was a long silence when she finished. Then thunderous applause. Not the polite kind. The kind that shakes the floor. The kind that tells you something you said actually mattered. Emily stood there, blinking back tears, overwhelmed by the realization that her story, his story, had truly landed. In the weeks that followed, things changed in ways Emily never expected. Young students from engineering schools began writing her letters, saying her speech inspired them to think differently about invention. Environmental advocates praised the implications of Merryweather's design. A few daring academics began digging into old archives, trying to find more about his life, other possible prototypes. But most surprising of all was the growing chorus of ordinary people. Emails from mechanics, retired sailors, grandmothers who'd lost husbands at sea, teenagers fascinated by forgotten history, all writing to say one thing: thank you for not letting him be forgotten. It was one letter, though, that truly changed everything. It came in a battered envelope, handwritten in looping script. Inside was a photograph of a young man standing beside what looked like a second engine, smaller, similar design, partially completed, dated 1933. On the back, my father's shop. Last thing he built before they came for him. He always said he hid the rest where they couldn't find it. It was signed Eleanor Merryweather. Emily's breath caught. The story wasn't over. She contacted Eleanor, who turned out to be Harrison Merryweather's only surviving granddaughter, living quietly in Maine. She had never spoken publicly about her grandfather's work, too afraid, too uncertain. But after seeing Emily's interview on the news, she said she finally felt safe to come forward. They met over tea in a sunlit kitchen filled with old books and framed black and white photos. Eleanor cried when Emily showed her a picture of the restored engine. "I never thought I'd live to see it again," she whispered. She then handed Emily a faded leather journal, Harrison's last notebook. Inside were sketches of more than just engines. He had been working on a plan for full-scale maritime fuel conversion. The designs, if proven, could revolutionize how ships move, how coastal towns power themselves, how we relate to the sea. Emily sat in stunned silence, tears rolling down her cheeks. This wasn't just a moment in history. It was the beginning of something much bigger. And just like that, the story she thought had ended with rust and gears and oil-stained fingers was just beginning a whole new chapter. Emily had always believed the past held answers, but now, for the first time, it was showing her the future. The journal Eleanor Merryweather handed her that rainy afternoon was more than just a relic. It was a blueprint for change, for energy, for transportation, for the way humanity could interact with the sea without wounding it. She stayed up all night, reading by the fire. The pages were filled with calculations, diagrams, notes scribbled in margins. Harrison Merryweather wasn't just building an engine, he was building a system, a sustainable power source for ships, ports, even remote coastal towns, all based on saltwater energy conversion and magnetic compression. It was elegant, it was brilliant, and it had been silenced for nearly a century. The following week, Emily found herself sitting across from Dr. Zoe Whitaker once again, only this time, not in a dusty workshop or foggy harbor, but in a quiet university office in Boston. Zoe was stunned as she flipped through the journal. This is beyond historical. This could be the foundation for real, working technology. We've been clawing at this for decades. Saltwater energy has always been dismissed as theoretical, But he had it mapped out in 1933. Emily nodded. And he didn't just write about it. He built it. Tested it. Zoe leaned back in her chair. Then it's time we do the same. Within a month, Emily found herself involved in something she never imagined, a research initiative. Zoe had quietly gathered a team of ethical engineers, historians, marine technicians, and environmental scientists, each sworn to secrecy. They called the project Merryweather Rising. Their goal was not just to honor Harrison Merryweather's work, but to replicate it, test it, and if possible, bring it into the modern world. But Emily wasn't there as a bystander. She was at the center of it. Not because she was a scientist, not because she was an inventor, but because she had done what no one else had. She listened to the past. She cared enough to see it through. For the first time in her life, Emily traveled outside the country to a coastal research facility in Nova Scotia, where ocean energy trials could be run safely, far from prying eyes. She stood on the steel platform as engineers prepped the replicated version of Merryweather's prototype. The salt air was sharp, and the wind snapped the hood of her jacket. But all she could feel was hope. Real, tangible hope. Henry, of course, had insisted on joining her. "If this thing blows up," he said with a grin, "I want a front row seat." The team fired up the engine. It didn't explode. It didn't sputter. It ran, smooth, silent, clean, just like it had in her little boat shed back in Port Haven. But now it was measured. It was recorded. It was real in the language the world demanded: data, metrics, evidence. News didn't break right away. The team agreed on a strategy: no press, no public release, until it was safe, until the technology could be protected and kept from being buried again by greed or fear. But something had already shifted. Investors, once obsessed with quick profit, began whispering about sustainable maritime propulsion. Universities opened new grant funds for oceanic energy research. A coastal town in Newfoundland contacted the team asking if they could pilot the system to power their harbors. What had started as a rescue mission in the deep had become something far greater. A movement. Back in Port Haven, Emily returned to her quiet dock, but nothing felt the same. The town had changed. People had started to notice her more, not out of fame, but respect. Local students came asking for advice on science projects. The mayor invited her to speak at the annual Harbor Day Festival. But the most touching moment came from the least expected place. A young girl, maybe 12, stood at the edge of the dock one morning, clutching a notebook. Her mother stood behind her, gently nudging her forward. "Are you Miss Caldwell?" the girl asked softly. Emily smiled. "That's me." The girl stepped closer, holding out her notebook. On the cover, written in careful handwriting, "My invention journal. I want to build things that help the world," she said. "Like you did." Emily knelt down, fighting tears. "I didn't build it. I just brought it back." "But you believed in it," the girl whispered. "No one else would have." Emily took a deep breath. That's where all inventions start, with someone who believes, even when no one else does. From that day forward, Emily dedicated a portion of her time to mentoring. Not lecturing in auditoriums, not doing press tours, but teaching quietly the way she knew best. She invited young minds into her workshop, helped them tinker, guided their hands on metal and wire. She taught them how to listen not just to machines, but to the stories behind them. And more importantly, she taught them something no textbook ever could. That buried beneath the rust, the silence, and the forgotten, lies the power to change everything. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the sea, Henry joined her on the dock. Max lay at their feet, snoring lightly. "You ever think it'd go this far?" Henry asked, sipping from his chipped mug. Emily shook her head, eyes fixed on the horizon. "I thought I was just fixing a broken engine." Henry chuckled. "No, You were fixing a broken silence." She smiled, letting the wind carry her thoughts. The past had whispered, and she had answered. Now, the future was listening. The ocean had always been a place of peace for Emily Caldwell. But now, it had become something deeper, something sacred. It wasn't just the water anymore. It was him, Harrison Merryweather. Though decades separated them, Emily often felt as if he were beside her, guiding her hands when she tightened a bolt, whispering through old blueprints, steadying her resolve when doubt crept in. But there were days she couldn't help but wonder. Why her? Why had the ocean chosen her to uncover this legacy? It was on one of those days, gray-skied and restless, that Emily received a call that stopped her heart. Henry had collapsed. He'd been helping a neighbor lift an engine block when he stumbled, clutched his chest, and fell. Emily arrived at the hospital before the ambulance lights had even faded from the parking lot. She found him in a narrow room, pale, quiet, wires snaking across his chest. Machines blinked rhythmically. And though he greeted her with his usual smirk, told you engines were safer than people, Emily could see it in his eyes. He was scared, and so was she. The next few days felt like a dream unraveling. Henry had been there for everything: the discovery, the restoration, the first breath of the engine, the break-ins, the threats, the victory. He was her anchor, her sounding board, her friend. And now he was fragile, mortal. One evening, as she sat at his bedside, he reached over and placed a weathered hand on hers. "I'm proud of you." He said softly. She tried to smile, but her lips trembled. "You did it. You gave the world something it never knew it had lost. That takes more guts than welding iron." She looked down at their hands, voice barely a whisper. "I didn't do it alone." Henry chuckled faintly. "No one does. But only you believed it was worth saving." After that night, something shifted in Emily. She had always seen herself as a rescuer of relics, of history, of forgotten stories. But she had never realized she needed saving too. The project. The engine. Merryweather, they had filled a hole inside her she didn't even know existed, her whole life. She had lived on the edge of things, on boats, in back rooms, tucked behind soldering smoke and rusted dreams. Now, for the first time, she saw herself through others' eyes. A fighter, a guardian, a builder of second chances. She began writing again, something she hadn't done in years. Journals, letters to her younger self, notes she would never send. One entry read, "I used to think the only stories worth telling came from the past. But now I know sometimes the most powerful ones begin in silence, in small sheds, in forgotten bays, in people like me, who dare to believe that old things still have value." She started receiving letters, too. One was from the daughter of a late ship engineer who said Merryweather's work reminded her of her father's dreams he never lived to see fulfilled. Another from a young woman who had been about to quit engineering school until she heard Emily's story. Each letter carried a weight, but also a light. A few weeks later, Henry was discharged. His steps were slower now, and he grumbled about the bland hospital food. But Emily could see something had awakened in him too. They returned to the workshop together. Not to build, but to teach. Emily began holding free community sessions every Saturday. Kids came from all over, some curious, some broken, some just looking for a place to belong. She didn't teach theory. She taught them how to listen, how to touch rust with reverence, how to hear the soul of a forgotten engine, how to find value in what others called junk. One boy, maybe 14, was silent for the first 2 weeks. He sat in the back, hood up, arms crossed. Emily never pushed. Then one day, he stayed after everyone else had left. "My dad used to fix boats," he said quietly, before he went away. Emily waited. "He said machines speak a language. I thought that was dumb, but when I saw the engine video, I think I finally understood what he meant." Emily nodded, her voice warm. "It's not dumb. It's beautiful." From that day on, he was the first to arrive, the last to leave. But the moment that broke her, truly shattered her, came unexpectedly. A small package arrived at her door. No return address. Inside was a faded, black and white photograph. It showed Harrison Merryweather standing beside the prototype engine, but next to him was a young girl, no more than 7, holding his hand. On the back, in delicate script, he said one day, someone would finish what he started. He always believed it would be a woman. He said the sea would listen better to someone who felt more than she claimed to know. Emily sat down on her porch steps. The photo clutched to her chest. And for the first time since the discovery, she wept. Not because she was sad, but because she knew she had been the right person. All along. That night, she walked alone to the dock. The water was still, the stars sharp above her. She whispered a quiet thank you to the sea, to Merryweather, to all the forgotten voices that had carried her here. Max rested beside her. Henry watched from the porch. She had grown, not just in recognition, not in reputation, but in who she was. Emily Caldwell, once a quiet woman in a quiet town, had become a vessel for something ancient, something brave, something eternally unfinished. And the world was finally listening. The engine now stood behind crystal-clear glass in the center of the National Maritime Legacy Hall. It gleamed like a monument not just to mechanical genius, but to the enduring power of belief. The brass plate still bore the words, H. Merryweather. 1932. Prototype, Muncher 3. But now, beneath it, a new plaque had been installed. Simple, understated. Restored by Emily Caldwell, for the voices history forgot. That final sentence had been Emily's only request. She hadn't planned to attend the exhibit's grand unveiling. She'd told the museum she preferred to let the engine speak for itself. But at the last minute, she arrived quietly through the side entrance. Max in tow. Henry slowly walking beside her, leaning slightly on a cane. The hall was packed. Families, veterans, engineers, dreamers, students in uniform, children holding hands with grandparents who whispered stories of old ships and forgotten oceans. The air buzzed with reverence. But when the curtain fell and the spotlight hit the engine, the room went still. No one clapped. No one spoke. They just stood there, in awe as if they were standing before a living ghost. Dr. Zoe Whitaker took the stage. She spoke not about technology or even science, but about legacy. About how one woman in a small harbor town refused to walk past rust and ruin. About how belief, when combined with action, can bring the dead back to life not just in metal, but in memory, in meaning, in momentum. She ended with a quote from Merryweather's final journal. They'll call it madness, but someday, someone will understand I wasn't building an engine. I was building a way home. When Emily stepped forward, the audience rose to their feet. But she didn't go to the microphone. Instead, she simply walked up to the glass, placed one hand gently on the side of the engine, just as she had the day she first raised it from the sea, and whispered, "Thank you for waiting." And then she smiled. In the months that followed, everything changed. Quietly, subtly, but undeniably. Across coastal regions, universities began launching programs focused on sustainable marine energy. Young engineers began studying Merryweather's principles. Government officials for once began asking the right questions. A research team in Iceland developed a working model of the saltwater conversion system and used it to power a small fishing fleet. A museum in Japan reached out to collaborate on a global Lost Inventions initiative. But for Emily, the most powerful changes weren't in the headlines. They were in the letters she received. One came from a ship mechanic in Greece. "We always thought our job was just to keep old things running. You reminded us that old things can still teach us how to move forward." Another from a young girl in India. "My school doesn't have computers, but I drew your engine in my notebook and told my class your story. Now, we all want to be inventors." And one, typed out carefully, from a man who had lost his son at sea. "When I saw the engine, I cried. Not because of what it does, but because someone cared enough to bring something back. You brought something back. You gave me hope that the ocean still gives, not just takes." Back in Port Haven, life resumed its gentle rhythm. But Emily had changed. She still walked the docks every morning, still worked in her father's old workshop, still fed Max at the same time each evening. But her steps were lighter now, her shoulders straighter, and every so often, she would stop at the edge of the pier, close her eyes, and listen not for sounds, but for presence. The sea no longer felt like a mystery. It felt like a companion. One afternoon, she received a visitor, a young woman in her 20s, boots muddy, eyes bright. She introduced herself as an engineering student from Michigan who had driven across the country just to find Emily. She held out a folder of sketches. Engines, water turbines, hybrid systems. They all said I was dreaming too big, she said, eyes shimmering. "But then I saw your story. I just wanted to meet the person who proved that the world still needs dreamers." Emily took the folder, flipped through the pages, then looked up with a gentle smile. "It's not about proving them wrong," she said. "It's about proving to yourself that the story isn't finished." She handed the folder back. "Now go finish it." That night, Emily stood in her workshop alone. The shadows stretched long. The wooden walls creaked in the wind. And on the shelf, tucked between old tools and a rusted compass, sat the first bolt she'd ever removed from Merryweather's engine. It was worn, almost crumbling, but she kept it, because it reminded her that every great movement begins with one person willing to turn the first bolt. In the final scene, we see her walking down the beach at sunrise, barefoot, Max racing ahead, barking into the waves. The sky glows gold, the tide returns. She kneels down, picks up a piece of driftwood, and smiles. Because somewhere out there in the silent depths, another story waits to be found. And she'll be ready. She thought she was just fixing a broken engine, but in truth, she restored something far more powerful, a legacy, a belief, a reason to keep listening. Because sometimes the most important discoveries aren't made in laboratories or boardrooms, but in quiet towns, in forgotten bays, in the heart of someone brave enough to believe that rust can shine again. Sometimes the world teaches us that if something is old, forgotten, or broken, it's no longer worth saving. But Emily Caldwell's journey proves the opposite. She didn't chase glory. She didn't set out to change history. She simply saw value where others saw decay. And that belief, that quiet, stubborn belief, became the spark that lit a global movement. Her story teaches us that greatness often begins in silence. That behind every rusted bolt, every lost journal, every overlooked soul, there might be something extraordinary waiting to be seen, understood, and heard. We live in a world obsessed with the new, but Emily reminds us sometimes the future isn't ahead of us. It's beneath us, waiting to be rediscovered. And all it takes is someone brave enough to listen. The end. Up next, 2 more powerful stories waiting for you. Click to keep discovering with us, and don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe the forgotten still deserve to be found.